All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have a special treat for you. It's part two of the Dr. Reitze Rodseth episode. We were originally scheduled to do the show on Friday or Saturday, I forget which, but something came up. So we had to reschedule. And the good news is I have Dr. Rodseth here today with me. Hey there, Reitze. How are you?
Adele, I'm doing well. Thanks very much. And thanks for this opportunity to join you.
No problem. Yeah, our mutual friend, Dr. Joseph Bergeron, I gave you a very high recommendation, and I know I had a great time when he was on the show, so I was happy to invite you on. But just before we get into today's topic, which is on the issue of transgenderism, I just want to, why don't you just kind of introduce the audience as to who you are, a little bit about your background, and maybe share some of your faith journey, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So my name is Reitze Rodseth. I'm half Dutch, half Norwegian, and I live in South Africa. I'm married to my wife, Miranda. She's a radiologist, and I've got two sons, Josh and Nathan. They're 8 and 6, and they keep me going. I'm very busy. By training, I'm a medical doctor, and I specialized in anesthesia and then subsequently in intensive care. Spent a lot of time doing clinical research, and I have a master's in anesthetics and a master's in health research methodology from McMaster University. We spent 2 years in Canada there, and then I've got a PhD in anesthetics as well. And I've published quite a lot of work. I always say I'm a bit of a research nerd. So I've probably published about 130 plus peer-reviewed papers, and I'm quite passionate about the whole research component. I think that's what God has gifted me with, and it's been quite a journey to be involved with that. And it's through that actually that I became involved in the whole transgender issues. From the work that I've done around apologetics, we became aware of the issues probably about 7 years ago as it started to raise its head in South Africa. And I was really appalled by the statements that were being made and the clinical research that underpinned these statements. And as I started talking about this, it started to gain momentum. And there was a time in my life where I didn't do gender talks. Now for the last 4 or 5 years, it's about the only subject I ever speak on. My faith journey, I was raised in a Christian home, two wonderful parents that taught me about Jesus. But I had quite a lot of questions around it. And I think as I went into university and subsequently started to do my postgraduate training, a lot of the answers weren't adequate for me. I think it's an experience that a lot of people go through. And sort of these doubts started to undermine my belief in faith. And there was a point where I felt like I was living a double life. We went through to Canada. As I mentioned, we spent 2 years there. I was on a research fellowship, and my PhD supervisor, he was an atheist, quite an ardent atheist. And he confronted me about, why do I believe all of this stuff? It's a fairy tale and it's a delusion. And I sort of took that to heart, and I probably spent about 6 months asking myself, if this stuff is not true, then I'm wasting my time. And I'd be better off spending my Sundays doing something else. And so really, to the best of my ability, looked at whether I could show the Christian faith to be true, to have a true basis. I compared that against Islam and then against atheism. And I think after 6 months of training and studying, I came to the intellectual conviction that Jesus was who he said he was, and that he rose from the dead, which left me with a bit of a dilemma, because now I couldn't hide away, intellectually anymore. I had to face the reality of it. And about 6 months later, then I became a Christian, where I submitted myself to Christ. And that's sort of been our journey. It caused quite a shift in our walk, sort of the directions where we're going, and reorientated ourselves. And we've been back in South Africa for 10 years and been involved quite a lot with this apologetic stuff. I'm also a member of Reitze Christi, which I don't know if you're aware of them. They're Christian apologetics groups that are active on campuses. So that's sort of my background.
Awesome. Well, it's as I said, great to have you on the show, and for you to share your expertise, especially on this very hot topic issue of the LGBTQ and especially transgender movement and that sort of thing. So glad to have you on. And just so the audience knows, the format for today that Rietze and I agreed to, Rietze is going to make a presentation for you guys, and he has some slides to share with you. After that, we'll have a bit of a dialogue after the presentation and kind of discuss some of the points he raises. So with that, Rietze, I will bring up your slides. Do you want me to, I guess I'll put it full screen. There you go. Over to you to make your presentation there.
Thanks very much. As we go through this discussion point, if you do want to ask any questions, feel free to do so. But basically, as I walk through this process, I think it becomes important to see the issues that lie deeper than the surface. As complex a topic as this is, there are deeper issues at play here. And that's why I often, particularly speaking to Christian audiences, talk about the concept of identity and how God relates to identity. And I'll be taking this track through the discussion as we go through it. So just here's my background. We have touched on this. I'm a medical specialist, subspecialist and anesthetist, and critical care subspecialist. I've got 2 master's degree, a PhD. I'm an associate professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I'm currently busy with a master's in Christian philosophy and apologetics. I always put in this disclaimer that I'm not a psychiatrist or a child psychiatrist, and I don't have experience in treating people with gender dysphoria, and I don't treat any persons with gender dysphoria, and that this presentation does not constitute clinical advice. And I speak in my capacity today as a member of Reitze Christi and not as a representative of any other organization. And I speak as an expert in the analysis of the quality of research. That's my area of expertise. And that's the frame with which I'm going to be discussing this whole issue. So when we talk about identity, identity speaks to who am I? It's a sort of a core part of who we are. One of these definitions of identity is a person's sense of self, providing sameness and continuity over time. And this is established by our unique characteristics, affiliations, and social roles. And that's interesting because I'm a very different physical being than I was when I was 21. I've got a lot less hair these days. But there's a sameness of me that persists through time. This is this core identity that I have. And as this says, it's characterized by certain affiliations, social roles. So I'm a father, I'm an anesthetist, I'm a Christian. These contribute and build this concept of my identity. But an important point to note here is that it's a person's sense of self. So the question then arises, what is a person? And I believe that this is the most important question. Before you can answer the question, who am I, you need to know what you are. And what you are provides a framework for us that allows you to think carefully and thoughtfully through that question. And the question then is, what is a human being? If we look at it from a Christian perspective, we are created by God. So we are not God. We are a creature. We're a strange mishmash of matter and spirit. We are not just spirit. We're not just matter. We will receive a glorified body. This is what being human is. We are created in the image of God, which means that we have value and that we are relational. And I think that's an interesting aspect, is that the relational side is echoed in the Trinity. So an important point, as I've said here, is that the what is the foundation for the who. If you don't understand what you are, you can get really lost in trying to figure out who you are. And I often think of this as a little bit as the fence around our garden. We've got quite a big garden. My boys go wild here. They play rugby and soccer and baseball and just everything. And they can express themselves in a secure space. But it's that fence that allows them to do that. It's the foundation or the boundary that allows them to discover who they are. So if we just dive a little bit into this identity concept, we can see that, as I've highlighted here, it's a person's sense of self and provides sameness and continuity over time. And it is established by your unique characteristics, affiliations, and social roles. And what that meant in our culture recently is that it started to become a particularly strong understanding of your dignity, your pride, and your honor. So when we start talking about identity in our modern context, these concepts are very, very prominent in discussions, and often are, I think, the reason why people get so really worked up when you start to attack, inverted commas, their identity. These concepts of dignity, pride, and honor, and these are very strongly linked with social characteristics, social categories that people attach themselves to. So I am trans, I am homosexual, I am a Christian. They become, in many parts, the defining characteristics. The question then becomes, how do we as Christians ground ourselves? So I think I've touched on a little bit of this, that we are created. So the foundational point of our identity is that we are created in the image of God. But what makes Christians unique is that this created entity has gone through a recreation in some ways. So if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. And so as Christians, we find our whatness in what God created, and the who-ness in Jesus Christ. Who am I? I am a Christian. I'm a new creation in Christ. So Os Guinness talks about contrast being the mother of clarity. I find this very useful to compare this to what I would say the spirit of the age is. It's not a complete categorization of it, but I think when we talk about the trance, this type of framework that I'm going to compare now underpins a lot of what we see. So, yes.
Sorry to butt, and I don't know if you're going to be covering this in an upcoming slide, but I find this question, this philosophical question, fascinating. As a fellow master's in philosophy myself, I notice with the transgender movement, I'm kind of, they sort of, when they answer this question, what am I? There is this reductionistic mindset where, I am my sexuality, like that defines everything I am and stuff. Where I'm just kind of curious as to your thoughts, and my apologies if you're going to be covering this in an upcoming slide, but where does this false understanding of defining people, my identity is my sexuality or is my gender or something like that, where does that come from? And
Yeah, so I think the first point is on a broader concept. If you sort of think 2 or 3 slides back where I said, what is a modern understanding of identity? This implicitly linking it to a social category becomes really critically important. So people, and I think at its heart, they don't understand who they are or what they are. And so you don't have a fence, you don't have a foundation. And so you are called to create your own identity in some way. And identifying very strongly with a specific social category allows a sense of identity. It sort of sounds a bit reductionist, but a sense of purpose, a sense of dignity. And by rejecting their identity and the categorization of that identity, they see that as a rejection of themselves. But the reason that they identify so strongly with that is that there isn't a foundation on which to build this character, to build this personality around. And so when you attack it, it becomes really, really intense. But I think at its heart is because there's an emptiness or a vacantness, unsure of how to classify themselves, and so pour themselves into one category. I often say, I used to do this, or I still probably do. I'm an anesthetist, so my identity is built around my job, or I'm a researcher, and that's not a foundational thing. At one stage in my life, I'll reach the point where I can no longer give an anesthetic, and in 50 years, no person's going to care about my publications. And so, what am I then? If I'm not first the creation in that God has created, and if I'm not redeemed in Christ, then what am I? I need to create this thing. And I think what's happening here is that they're creating this identity for themselves to fill a missing something.
Awesome. So go ahead.
I want to take that and sort of just move into this. So, if we would say that from a Christian perspective that we are created, I think the modern age would answer this question of what is a human being. They would say that we are spiritual beings. I think most people, when you just talk, reject, or they're not atheists in the classic sense of the word. And many people will talk about having some spirituality. So this is a theme that you see quite a lot. Humans are spiritual beings. They have a divine spark or a piece of God within us. And this is trapped within the human flesh. And by obtaining this knowledge of your divineness and realizing that you're trapped in this material world, you can free yourself from it. You can sort of throw off this fleshly created order. You discover your true identity. And this is tying in with the points that you've said and sort of raised now. And if you look at this, you can see these themes come through on a lot of the social networks, on a lot of the chat groups, some of the writings as well. It says that we are not a created entity. We are trapped in some ways. And if you sort of trace this down, this is the equivalent of the old religion of Gnosticism, which says that through knowledge we will gain a godliness or a godhood, like we can just throw off these scales and these this flesh that binds us. And in some ways, Gnosticism is almost the original sin, because you know that Satan tempts Adam and Eve by saying that God knows in the day that you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so this promise of knowledge somehow unlocking your misery and allowing you to escape this material world and enter into your fullness as a created entity. Now, I see this echoed incredibly strongly in the transgender movement. You're probably aware of this thing that's called a gender unicorn. And it's a way that children are taught to understand themselves. So first thing to notice in this is that you're not a single entity. You're this mishmash of different things. You have your gender identity, then your gender expression, your sex assigned at birth, your physical attraction, and your emotional attraction. And you decide this. You determine these things. You build your own identity from this. In doing so, you discover your divine spark. And you understand that you are caught in the shackles of this flesh. And when you release it, you throw it off, you're able to find your true identity and enter into, this higher level of existence, this higher plane of existence. So I think if you compare on a broad level, sort of on a meta level, there are two worldviews that underpin or that sketch out some of this conflict that we're facing. And they're absolutely fundamental. And there's a dramatic clash of worldviews here of what is meaning, what is value. And I think that this informs a lot of the discussion that we're having. We have the surface level discussion around the whole trans thing, but there's definitely a deep spiritual component that underpins this whole debate. I quite like minions, so I throw them in every now and again as a placeholder.
Very
All right,
good.
so I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit and then start diving into the details a bit more. Any questions or thoughts there?
No, believe it or not, I was just learning. Yeah, the gender unicorn. I guess I'm too old at this point. I never learned when I was in school the gender unicorn, and I'll just say thank goodness for that. But yeah, I can see now. Go ahead.
It used to be the genderbread man. So it was a gingerbread man, but called the genderbread man. But that was considered to be too, too male, too sexist. So we shifted to the unicorn.
Oh goodness!
All right. So I'm going to sort of dive into the details a little bit of this, and again, I like pictures; they help me to remember stuff. And there'll be a short quiz at the end of this podcast, so get yourself ready.
I'm taking notes.
Yeah. One of the key things when you talk about the transgender issue is to have your categories clearly understood. I think one of the biggest problems that we have is when we talk about this, we conflate different categories. And in the debate, your opponents will often purposefully conflate the categories. And so what I'm trying to give here is a framework for you to think about it thoughtfully, carefully, be able to engage in a thoughtful discussion, equip yourself, and bring a little bit of light to this very intense topic. So the first category I'm going to start off over here, and I often speak mainly to South African audiences. This is Caster Semenya. She's very famous in South Africa for having really had huge success in the 800 meters at the Olympics. And I use her as an example of what is called a DSD. It's a disorder of sexual development, and previously known as intersex. So this is an important starting point for us to work from. When we look at sex is defined by its reproductive function. Mammals have a male and a female. The male provides sperm and the female provides an ovum. And that creates a new entity, and that entity is either male or female, and humans procreate after their kind, and they create children. Dogs create dogs. And then the humans, we have got in the females an XX chromosome, and in the males an XY chromosome. And this is the foundational definition of what sex is. You probably have to go to an English department and be trained for 4 years to be able to confuse the fact that you need a male and a female to reproduce. This is just foundational biology. There's no discussion about this. But just like any other inherited or genetic problem, you can inherit genetic problems in your sexual development. And these come in two broad categories, either genetic or hormonal. So if we look at the genetic categories, here's a problem in your inheritance of your sex chromosomes. So you saw the XX from your mom and the XY from your dad, and there's a problem in how you inherit those. And they are well defined, well delineated, well understood, and very rare. So the first syndrome is Turner syndrome. So there's an X, you receive one X chromosome from your mom and your dad, but you fail to get a second chromosome. And in this scenario, you have a female with Turner syndrome. So you're short, stocky, short neck, broad chest, shield-shaped torso, wide carrying angle of the arms, issues with infertility. The sort of its counterpart is a thing called trisomy X. Tri means 3, and in this case, you've inherited an extra X chromosome. So you're female with an additional X chromosome, and you have similar infertility problems, and there's a specific syndrome that is attached with that. Klinefelter syndrome, XY, so you're male, but you've got an additional X chromosome, and there's certain symptoms that fit into the syndrome that define it. So just like I have inherited adult onset alopecia, so I'm balding at a rapid rate, I've inherited that from my parents. So this is a genetic inheritance and a genetic abnormality in this person's chromosomal makeup. Yeah.
Just so on this question, I will admit the genetic DSD, or cases of like chromosomal hermaphrodites where like they're both kind of thing, right? I guess that's the XXY person, I guess, right? But how do we explain this theologically? If we are designed by God to just be male or female, how can there be this issue of chromosomal hermaphrodites? Yeah, like what are such people? Are they a boy or a girl? Is it their choice? And how does that fit with Christian theology?
Yeah, so from a Christian theological perspective, the answer to that is that we live in a fallen and broken world, and that affects all aspects of our existence. So just like some people develop Down syndrome, trisomy 21, you could ask the same question. God designed us to be perfect humans, but yet you have people or children with genetic abnormalities. And I think the answer to that is, as I've said, is we're living in a broken and a fallen world. And that affects all parts of it. As to what category these individuals fit into, if a human is in utero and doesn't get exposed to testosterone, they develop as a female. So Turner syndrome and trisomy X are females. Klinefelter syndrome is a male with female features. So on a genetic level, you can identify whether the people are male or female. So, and this is why I say there's not this huge amount of confusion around this as people think there are. It's from a genetic perspective, it's fairly easy to identify. You just look at the hormonal makeup of it. It becomes more difficult in what I'm going to talk about in the next phase, is when we start to talk about how the people look and how the presentation of those people come through. But from a fundamental genetics perspective, it's quite easy to identify and to build out the syndromes.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
So you could have normal genetics, but you can have problems with your hormonal makeup or the way that you produce or the way that you respond to testosterone. So this is an example of two syndromes. One is called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. The other one is called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Androgens are things like testosterone. And these people don't make or don't respond to testosterone. So they're genetically male, XY, but because they haven't been exposed to testosterone in utero, they develop as a female. And when the child is born, they don't have a formed penis, and they've got a labia, and so look like a girl. And they will be raised as a girl. But in most cases, they have some sensitivity to testosterone, and they still have testes. So what happens is, as the girl starts to grow, genetically male, looks female, the testosterone levels start to go up, and they start to grow. They've got a genetic blueprint which is male. And so they start to put on muscle mass, they start to gain height, their facial features become more masculine, start to develop a bit of an Adam's apple. But because of the muscle mass, they become strong. And when they run against other girls, they beat them. And then they run at school level and they win, so they get selected for the nationals, and then they run nationals and they get selected to run internationally, and then they get tested internationally. And then all of this stuff starts to happen. And this is so you have this female that's walking around, to the eye female, that is walking around with testosterone levels way, way above what a normal woman would have. And this is the story of Caster Semenya. And it's a well-described phenomenon in sport as a result of these factors that I've just laid out for you. So in power events, sprinting, maybe up to about 1,500, and then things like long jump, shot put, javelin, these genetic males who look female will outperform the woman because of their high level intrinsically of testosterone. So this is the DSD category, disorders of sexual development, or as we'd call it, intersex. So one of the questions I often get is like, how are we as Christians supposed to deal with or engage with somebody with a DSD? And I normally look to this passage in John chapter 9, where Jesus is walking with his disciples, and they see a man that was born blind, and they say to him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, nobody sinned here, that this was as God wanted it to be, because this is a way that he will glorify himself. And I think this is an important way for us to look at people with these conditions, exactly the same way as you would look at somebody with Down syndrome. It's not their sin that they're sitting in this condition or in this state. We are called to redeem those individuals through Jesus Christ. This is an opportunity for God to demonstrate his glory and his love for us, and for those people. So a Christian response to an individual with the DSD is the same as an individual with Down syndrome or with a congenital hole in their heart. The issue there is not their genetic problem. The issue there is what's their relationship with Jesus. These individuals that do have these DSDs raise difficult questions around sporting aspects. So with Caster Semenya, they tested her testosterone levels, and they were significantly higher than what was acceptable for the International Athletics Federation. And she then went on testosterone blockers to bring her testosterone levels down to what was acceptable. They've got a cutoff, a threshold. It led to quite a significant reduction in the 800-meter time. And this sort of started happening towards the end of her career. And I think she raced for about another year or two, and then stopped racing internationally. But at the stage that she was racing, there were probably about an Indian sprinter, I think about 2 other individuals in the 800 that probably had a similar condition. So this is a very interesting category. The important thing to understand here is that DSD is not trans, and people with DSDs are not homosexual, not homosexual, LGBT. It's a different category. It's a medical condition, and in particular in South Africa, because of the prominence of Caster Semenya, whenever we get in these discussions, everybody starts reaching to Caster, to the DSD bucket, to try and argue and discuss the issues around trans. But it's not a legitimate step. The category is quite distinct and different from the other categories, and it's important to understand it and then be able to put it in a corner and say, okay, let's just hold this here. We're dealing with something different when we start to talk about trans individuals. Does it make sense?
Yep, I'm getting it.
Okay, great. So the second category that I want to talk about is what I would call classic transgenderism. This is the type of transgenderism that we saw when I grew up and trained in doing medicine, which is around 2000. I got my degree then. And the person that I use as a classic example of this is Bruce Jenner, who then became Caitlyn Jenner and was then voted to be the Vogue Woman of the Year. Quite a dramatic step to do, to choose a male over the rest of the world. Anyway, Bruce is a classic example of the classic transgender categories, and I'm going to talk about that because it lays the framework for the rest of this discussion. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about gender and gender definitions. So when we talk about gender, it's sometimes a little bit tricky to try and define it. But the way that I do this is to say that women have feminine characteristics and men have masculine characteristics. And if you look at 1,000 women, you're able to extract characteristics that are similar among them. If you look at 1,000 men, you have characteristics that are similar among them. You're able to pull this out and create like a picture of them. It doesn't mean that every single one of them has all of those characteristics. So women generally have long hair, wearing a dress, but if that woman is not wearing a dress, that doesn't mean that she's not feminine. But the interesting or the important thing about this is that these characteristics are anchored in biology. You can trace it down to the biological bedrock that provides the expression of, which is then expressed as masculine or feminine. And the important thing is to realize that cultural expressions of masculinity and femininity are different in different cultures. So when I'm doing this talk at an audience, I'm normally wearing what I would call the South African white male uniform, which is like a blue long sleeve shirt, khaki pants, brown shoes. And it always gets a bit of a laugh. And I said to the guys, well, if I was standing in front of you here today and I was dressed in a skirt and high heels, you would all be particularly uncomfortable. And everybody sort of nodded their head. And I said, but if I was standing in Scotland and I was wearing a kilt, there wouldn't be any issue at all. And so our cultures are different in how we express aspects of our masculinity or our femininity, struggling with that word, but they are anchored in the biological reality of it. So even though we might be dressing differently, when you look at the two cultures in Scotland, you will see these are the women and these are the men, and this is the biology that underpins it. So what has been introduced into our discussion, and I think is a bit of an illegitimate term, is this concept of gender identity. So gender identity is supposed to be your own sense of your own gender. So I feel male, or I feel female, or I feel neither male nor female.
So this is, can I just jump in? I had a question about the last slide, if it's okay. Let me know if I'm interrupting too much.
No, not at all.
It's good. All right, cool. So on this gender, I'm interested in the aspects or traits that are anchored in biology. And I'm kind of curious, do you, according to the scientific evidence, because I heard that there was a study done on animals like chimps and maybe other species, where these traits or these characteristics, that at least the ones anchored in biology, are the same across species, right? So it's the same in chimps as it is. So for example, chimps go towards certain toys versus female chimps go towards other toys or something like that. So like, are these traits that are anchored in biology, are they across species or are they specific for human beings? Like, are there differences? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there are similarities. I'm not an expert in that, and I must admit I haven't looked at it extensively. But the effect of something like testosterone across, it raises sexual drive, increases muscle mass. It is, we think, maybe an effect on the brain in terms of pushing it towards, well, let's put it like this way, bodybuilders that go on to high doses of testosterone demonstrate reduced levels of empathy, higher rates of aggression, lower levels of tolerance. So those are some of the extreme sides that you would associate with masculinity, classic masculinity. So definitely the hormonal effect of something like testosterone pushes you into this category that's pretty standardized. And you start to bring somebody onto estrogen, you see some of the classic feminine activities and behaviors and feelings start to emerge. So what you're seeing here is the biological effect on the brain as a result of the hormonal impact of that. And I think that's pretty well understood and well described. And it's very interesting as you're seeing normalization to a large degree of testosterone use in sport and bodybuilding, and we're starting to see a lot more data coming out of that. So yeah, definitely that characteristic or that clustering together is driven by, has a biological underpinning in it.
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah. Thanks. I was just interested in that question. So yep, go ahead.
So we're supposed to have this idea of gender identity, and I have quite a serious problem with this as a concept. So you have a 5-year-old and you ask the 5-year-old, what sex are you? And the child is male, and the child only knows what it means to be male. But now the child is supposed to look at a different sex and then decide that the child is actually female. Now, how is it possible for a male to know what it feels like to be a woman if they are a male? They can only have an impression of what they think it means to be a female. There's no way to experience what it really means to be the other sex. There's a very interesting article or thing written by a philosopher called Thomas Nagel, and he writes, "What is it like to be a bat?" And this whole sort of thrust of the article is to say that we can never experience what it is to be a bat. All that we can experience or imagine is a human imagining what it would be like to be a bat. So this very concept of a gender identity, that somehow you can identify as a woman when you're male, when you never knew what a woman was, is like really difficult to grasp. And it also, to a degree, explains some of the stereotypical behavior of transgender individuals. There's a very strong push to say, well, I can be whoever I want to be, but then I immediately get categorized as a female, and I adopt all these female characteristics in a very sort of traditional way, a very stereotypical way. So this very concept of a gender identity is something that I struggle with. I don't think it's a category that's actually a true category that's particularly useful. I think it has a lot of problems with it. Then linked to this is gender expression. It's how do I express myself? So this is gender-associated behavior, mannerisms, or appearances. And again, they come in the categories of feminine or masculine. Again, because these are anchored in our biology. And the important thing to understand about this is that my behavior, my mannerisms, my appearance, they are not the essential issue that's at play here. The essential issue of whether you're male or female speaks to human reproduction. And as I've said, your genetic makeup, XX or XY. All of these other things are what you'd call accidental or accidents. They're not fundamental. So if I got a dog and you ask me what is a dog, I'm going to say a dog's got like 4 legs and it's fluffy and it's got a tail and it's got 2 ears. But if you show me a dog that we shaved all the hair off, he lost a leg, he's got no tail and he's blind in one eye, it's still a dog. I might not be able to identify it by looking at it, but the reality of it, its underlying essence, is that it is a dog. Genetically, I can identify it as a dog. So I repeatedly make the statement that says that gender is not a social construct. It is influenced by social factors. Its expression is influenced by society, but it is anchored in biology. When we talk about gender expression misses this essence of sex, which is the reproductive component. Gender expression differs across the cultures, but every culture separates into male or female. And one of the best sort of references I've heard or ways of describing this is to say that trying to separate gender from reproductive sex is like trying to separate the waves from the ocean. You get into cold, dark, deep waters really quickly when you start to do that. So I'm going to jump back into our category. So here we've got Bruce Jenner. This is what I'd call classic transgenderism or persistent gender dysphoria. So these are people who struggle as children with gender dysphoria, or what was, I think, more accurately previously called gender identity disorder. This is an unease of a perceived mismatch between my biological self and my self-understood gender identity. And here there's this concept of gender identity coming on. Very highly associated with depression, anxiety, and suicide, and quite a debilitating impact on people's daily lives, which is often the reason why they'll start to present to psychiatrists or psychologists as a result of the other aspects around this, the depression, anxiety, and suicide. If we looked at the history of gender dysphoria, it was something that occurred much more commonly in men, 1 in 20,000 to 3 in 20,000, while in women less, 1 in 50,000, 1 in 30,000. This is something that's totally inverted currently, with much more young girls presenting in it. And supports a little bit of what I'll be talking about, that what we're seeing today is not this category. So the history of these individuals is that it's often men would start to present to psychiatrists, psychologists here around 23, 24, 25, maybe even later, with these histories of gender dysphoria and all of the associated problems with it, high amounts of depression, anxiety, alcohol abuse. And they would work with them and try to figure out, how can we make you feel better? So psychotherapy and a whole range of treatments were presented. And at one stage, the thought was, well, if you have the desire to be female, well, maybe we can dress you as female. Does that make you feel better? Let's transition you and say, well, we're going to give you estrogen, we're going to give you breast implants, we're going to castrate you. Does that make you feel better? And that triggered off a whole process of transitioning and a lot of experimentation to try and understand if this worked or not. One of the biggest and longest running studies, which is about 15 years in Scandinavia, showed that unfortunately this didn't have a major impact on people's long-term outcomes, with, again, high rates of depression, suicide in the populations that they continue to study, and also very high rates of suicide compared to sort of controls and normal population. So what then happened was a Dutch group decided to say, well, you get a 25-year-old who's got a broad jaw and an Adam's apple and shoulders and looks male. Now you're dressing this individual up as a woman, and of course they're not going to pass. People are going to look at them. Maybe we need to catch them earlier. And so this led to what is now developed into the gender affirming model of care. So what we do is say, before you start to spike into your puberty, so around what we call Tanner stage 2, which is around the ages of 9 to 12, before you start to go into this phase that makes you look like the sex that you are, we're going to block that. So we give you puberty blockers. Then at the age around 16, you start with cross-sex hormones. So if you're male, you get estrogen. If you're female, you get testosterone. And then at around 18 years, you then undergo surgery. And this treatment approach, now that has sort of developed and matured into the gender affirming model, evolved and developed out of this group of persistent gender dysphorics, and set the stage for where we are currently, and I think the misuse of this affirming model and all the consequences that we've had on it. So I asked the question again, what is a Christian response to somebody with gender dysphoria? And again, I'm going to refer to John, where Jesus gets asked, who sinned, this man or his parents? So whose fault is it? Who sinned that you have a family history of depression? Who sinned that you have a family history of schizophrenia? Who sinned that you have a problem of body dysmorphic disorder? I'm going to say no one sinned in that, but that is something that you can be born with, a depressive slant, schizophrenia, or gender dysphoria. And so that our response to individuals that are struggling with this psychologically is one of love and support. The question then comes, what do you do with this? How do you respond when you have gender dysphoria?
Can I sorry to throw you off again.
Yeah, go for it.
I have this one is a question that fits right in here from a member in the audience, Marvin Wallace, fellow Christian apologist there, and he's asking, look, Rietze, what you're presenting here is assuming that there actually are genuine cases of gender dysphoria, whereas I think Marvin would say, well, are there actual genuine cases, or is it just these people are deluding themselves into thinking that they feel like a male or feel like a woman? Like, what's your take on that? Are there genuine cases, or are people just deluded in thinking they feel like a man or a woman?
So when you started drill down into the different categories, particularly in males who present with gender dysphoria, there are different underlying factors on it. There's been a lot of pushback against this research because it doesn't fit into an acceptable narrative, but sort of the two broad categories are children with autism or autism spectrum type disorders that have very rigid understandings of male and female. So if I'm male, I must wear long pants and a blue shirt, and I don't like blue, so I can't be male. Or I'm female and I don't like short hair, but all females have got, sorry, you must have long hair, and so I don't like long hair, I can't be a female. So that's a one category, I think, in which a lot of people are presenting, particularly in the classic group, and they present that anxiety or this discomfort as gender dysphoria. So there's only so many ways in which we can express what's going on in our psyche. And so they're saying, I'm uncomfortable with being male. The reason behind it can be a whole range of stuff. So I believe that these individuals do have gender dysphoria. Why they have gender dysphoria is because of the rigidity of how they understand what's going on. And if you unpack that, and I think that's where psychotherapy and discussion around this becomes really important, they can unlock that and the symptom will resolve. The other category is a category called autogynephilia, is where there's a sexualized desire or attraction in seeing yourself or imagining yourself, a male imagining themselves as female. And that's probably a large component of what we saw in the classic transgender categories. And again, the question is what's going on that person would then present this as gender dysphoria. So what I'm trying to say with this broad category is the psychological underpinning, the cross that these individuals have to bear, is something that we need to engage with, that we need to, as Jesus has said, this is something that God can be glorified through. This is something that we need to engage with as somebody who is lost, who needs Jesus Christ. I'm just going to jump to this one. One of the things that we've asked, or people have looked at, is what do gender dysphoric Christians do? So somebody that struggled with gender dysphoria and they've sort of gone down the whole trans route, who then becomes a Christian, who has a new identity anchored in Jesus Christ. What do they do? How do they talk? So the first understanding is that they're saying that your body is sacred. This concept of the Gnostic viewpoint that my body is just dirt or flesh, I'm a meat puppet to be discarded or to be molded as I want, that's not right. Your body is a thing that has been created, that has a value to it. It is a healthy body generally. And so to damage it is to stain or to damage that image that Christ has placed in us. And so don't have surgery, don't mutilate it, don't change it. The second point is to find their identity in Jesus. And this maybe goes to the core of what you're asking. Realize that your identity is not your dysphoria. I'm not a trans individual. I'm a Christian, and I struggle with dysphoria, which could be a range of different aspects. I'm a Christian, and I struggle with with depression. Another theme that comes through quite strongly is this: each of us has something that we carry, a cross that we carry. You struggle with anger issues, you struggle with alcohol addiction, you struggle with pornography, you struggle with a whole range of it. Each of us has something that we sit with and that we fight with and picking up the cross, and this again coming from gender dysphoric individuals that have found Christ, they realize that this may be something that they will struggle with for the rest of their life, but that this doesn't define who they are, that their identity is in Jesus. Don't have the hormonal surgery, don't have the hormonal therapy, don't have the surgery. So you'll see that those will generally stop taking the cross-sex hormones, and to the degree that their bodies can reestablish their normal hormonal patterns, they will. Most guys don't have. Some people have, if they've had breast implants, they'll take them out. But generally, people don't have surgery to try and bring them back to their original bodies because of the impact of that surgery. But there's a rejection of this other identity. There's a rejection of the dysphoria as being their core identity. And it's replaced with one where the identity is anchored in Christ. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, really good. Thank you so much for that answer.
All right, so the quiz comes now. Top left-hand side, DSDs, disorders of sexual development, castesemania, hormonal abnormalities and genetic abnormalities. The historical, the classic, the persistent gender dysphoric, Bruce Jenner to Caitlyn Jenner, and this is what we'd seen up to about the year 2000. And now we sort of start getting to the category where everybody has a bit of is becoming more and more aware of it. And these are when we start seeing these issues in children. So an important characteristic or important cohort of individuals in this are what we call transient gender dysphorics or desisters. To desist means to stop, a cease and desist order says stop what you're doing. This is in contrast to the previous category in which you had these people that persisted with it. What we mean by that is that when children present with gender dysphoria, and this is again before 2000, where they were so unhappy with their with their sex, the role that they had to play, that they presented to child psychiatrists or psychologists. If you take those children and you follow them through their puberty, you'll see that the dysphoria does not inevitably persist into adulthood. And this is well described. There's a lot of research around this. In fact, 60 to 80% of children will no longer have gender dysphoria at the end of their puberty. There is, in this cohort of individuals, as I've mentioned, high incidences of autism, Asperger's type disease, and then same-sex attraction. And it's critical, and this is in just about every study that's a good study, the guy said that there's no reliable means to predict who will persist and who doesn't, who will persist and who will desist. One of the more recent Finnish researchers talks about puberty as a gender identity formation process. The actual process of going through puberty and the impact of the hormones consolidate your identity. And that's a natural process that you go through. And this is why we see at the end of puberty that the vast majority of these children that present with these issues no longer have the gender dysphoria. This is a quote from the Dutch clinic, the gender dysphoria clinic, where they write, before the age of 10, we suggest a cautious attitude towards transitioning. So here they're talking about social transitioning. Some girls who were almost but not entirely living as boys in the childhood years experienced great trouble when they wanted to return to the female gender role. We believe that parents and their caregivers should fully realize the unpredictability of their child's psychosexual outcome. And so we don't know what is going to happen to these children. We shouldn't pretend like we know what this, and I've seen a lot of this discussion in the media, as though it's that everything in the world can change except this child's understanding of their identity. The leading groups that have studied this, the guys that have come before them as well, say we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that between 60 to 80% of these children the problem will resolve. One of the key principles in medicine is first do no harm. It's actually the name of the sort of advocacy group that we started in South Africa here around this issue with some medical doctors. But if you know that the majority of people will get better, why undertake this incredibly drastic interventions that profoundly change an individual's life? And when you could sit back, support the individual, and then watch and see how it resolves. So this small category is an important category just to understand. And it forms it's a big discussion point. And again, I think inappropriately used in what's going to be our final category. So any questions there?
Yes, I think so. Although it may be coming up in the last section, but I posted up one of your old videos and was responding to it, where I think you were talking about it was a different number. It was 65 to 85%, I think, will, of transgenders regret it. They desist. And Ethan, a guy in the audience, Ethan Bergeron, is saying, I left a comment about that statistic, and they wanted to know, like, where is that coming from? So, um, yeah, I think they're happy with your answer, but I just wanted to, is that 65 to 85% of desisters? Why is that different than the 60 to 80%? Like, where are the numbers coming from?
So this stat over here, these are children who desist. So they're no longer they don't persist with their gender dysphoria. So the 60 to 80% is a range from about 4 or 5 different studies. What I try to do is be a little bit conservative in what I put in here. So it's probably why it's 60 to 80. And it speaks about the number of kids. So if you take 100 of them and you just follow them through this period and support them, again, I think that's important. It's not that you don't do anything, is that you're going to see that vast majority of these kids will no longer be sitting with the gender dysphoria. But in this group, they haven't transitioned them. So in the studies here, the clinics have provided holistic support to the individuals. You've got to realize that these individuals, they're not just gender dysphorics, which is a critical point that I think is overlooked. They come with a whole range of other psychosocial issues, anxiety, depression, autism issues, sexual abuse in some cases. And so one of the distortions of the discussions that we're happening is to reduce a human being to one diagnosis. And when the individuals are treated as a group, they, or not as a group, as a whole, as a full entity, you see this resolution, which seems to be guided by and then developed by the maturation of their, as they go through puberty. So I don't know if that's a statistic that's different in the presentation that I had.
Fair enough. And I think you just answered it, but Ethan just followed up based on your answer. What qualities a child has as having gender dysphoria?
Yeah, so these kids will the terminology that's used is they'll say they'll persistently, insistently, and sort of like constantly say, I'm not a boy, I'm not a boy, I'm not a boy. And they will constantly express a desire to dress or to be treated as an individual of the opposite sex, and complain and be unhappy about the fact that they're being made to dress as a boy, to the point where it starts to create dysfunction in the home, and then the parents will start to seek help on this. And the categories that we're talking about here are not what we're seeing at the moment. This falls into that category of the classic transgenderism. This data that I'm talking about precedes this wave of what I'll talk about in the next phase. And so this was also happening before the big push of social media. So you're seeing children that are within themselves presenting with this problem or this sense of unhappiness. But again, when I say children and humans, we only have so many ways to express our feelings. And the kids are feeling a range of stuff, and that will sometimes consolidate and come through around the gender dysphoria thing. And the belief that if I can become the other sex, then my problem will go away. The problem is often much more complex than just becoming the other sex, which also knows not something that's possible. So it's a insistent, persistent, consistent type of demand or statement that I am the other gender, and then to the degree that it starts to cause dysfunction in their lives and in those of their families.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, so castosemia DSDs, classic adult transgender gender dysphoria. We've got Bruce Jenner. We see these kids that used to desist, and some of them would persist and go into the Bruce Jenner category. And now we have a new category, and this is where the whole debate and the whole discussion is coming from. This is rapid onset gender dysphoria. That terminology has been attacked quite extensively, but I think it's spot on in what it says. So what we see is a rapid onset of gender dysphoria. It's like a surge, it's like a craze. It's happening in young adolescent girls between the ages of 14 and 18, sometimes now younger. And it's happening in female to male clusters. So what's always in the past, you've seen individuals wanting to transition. Now what you see is these groups of girls who want to become males, and they do it in groups. There's a clustering together. Either they're in the same school or in the same sport event, or they're in some type of social connection, often very tightly linked through the social media. And they will then say, well, I'm gender dysphoric and I want to transition to become male. And there'll be one or two, maybe three individuals in that group. And around them, a whole range of other behaviors that sort of seem to develop out of that same group. Children coming out as non-binary or asexual, or and this has been described and commented on quite extensively in the media, not in the media, in the academic circles, saying this is something new that we've never seen before. There's also no prior history of gender dysphoria. The families will report that the girls were, happily going along as a girl, and then as they're going into puberty, all of a sudden this gender dysphoria comes through. It has the features of a craze or a fad. We've seen it spill over from the US into the UK, and then from the UK into South Africa. What we also see is this happening in schools, and it goes from like one school to the next school. So just after the whole Black Lives Matter events kicked off and then came to an end, we had an outbreak of individuals saying that they were transgender at one of our big high schools here, private school. And then within about 4 months, there were 2 and 3 more clusters in the other schools. It's an incredibly high social value action, particularly in today's culture and society. So you can imagine that you're going through puberty, you're feeling clunky, and you've got longer limbs than what you used to have, and you're getting lumps and bumps, and you just don't fit in, and maybe you're overweight, and you just don't feel good about yourself, and you come out as transgender. It becomes something that you're praised for. You're brave. You found your identity. You've discovered your, who you really are. You're standing up for it, and those individuals become incredibly prominent and receive a lot of attention in their social circles. I do this talk often at schools, and when I deal with this side, you see all the teachers starting to nod their heads. So what we see in these adolescents is that the ones that are presenting like this have high incidences of depression, anxiety, cutting when they cut themselves with razors, and then eating disorders. And these individuals then come out as transgender or start to claim that they have gender dysphoria. And there is a massive, massive impact of social media, which acts as both driving the spread of the idea, but also as a support process. And one of the commentators talks about the rules on the internet. So the first rule is that nobody cares about you. The first rule that you get is that if you think you are transgender, then you are transgender. So the fact that you were abused, or that your family member has died, or you've just been a divorce and that might have influenced you, that doesn't matter. If you think you're transgender, then you are. And then the second rule is that nobody cares about you except us, your glitterati family online. Your parents don't care about you. The school doesn't care about you. Nobody cares. Only we will look after you. And then the third one is, as soon as you get the testosterone, your life will be better. And so it pulls children away from their support networks. It poisons them against their support networks, and then creates this closed loop in which getting the testosterone is the thing that will improve your outcomes. So what I think is happening here is it's two things. One is there's a medicalization of puberty. puberty is a process of understanding who you are and who you're going to become. And this researcher from Finland has, I think, done some really nice work around that, showing that the process of puberty is critical in establishing your identity as both male or female. And we've turned that process into a problem. Not knowing who you are as you're going through puberty is a normal process. But now I'm feeling uncomfortable about that. I don't know really where I am. And now that is being attached to becoming gender dysphoria. And then the second component, I think it's particularly strong in the US, is this acceptance of an underlying ideology, which is that gender is a social construct and that you are what you think you are. So you can make your own reality. That concept of the Gnosticism, that I can identify my true inner spark and throw off this flesh that holds me back. I also think more recently that a lot of your public schools are preparing the ground through the queering of the education system. And so they've created a fertile ground ideologically, and there's this medicalization component of it that's led to this incredible explosion. So much so that we're now seeing people rejecting the need for dysphoria, because I'm saying I need the surgery because I'm dysphoric, but people are saying, well, I'm not really dysphoric. I just don't want to be what I am now. I want to be something else. And I have the right to be that, and I can choose what I am. So why should I go through this whole dysphoria? In fact, why should the medical community act as a gatekeeper? I can be whatever I want to be. And then linked on top of this, and I've mentioned this a little bit around the gender ideology, is incredibly aggressive activism, which everybody's experienced. Everybody, particularly 5 years ago, was saying, I'm crazy to do these type of talks because of the pushback that we get. Colleagues of mine have been reported to the universities. They've tried to block them from graduating. We've been reported to the Health Professionals Council, known as the right-wing transphobic doctor from KwaZulu-Natal. And everybody has experienced this. I think this coalesces, the medicalization, the ideology, all of this, and it's targeted and it's hit this group of children that are going through the puberty, these girls.
Just a quick clarifying question, if you don't mind, on the progressive activism, because that, like on a social level or political level, I think this is where everybody is kind of reacting against this extremely aggressive activism that we've seen in recent years. Are you saying, medically speaking, that in general, this notion to engage in this kind of activism is particularly seen only in this group and not so much in general in the other three categories of transgenders or gender dysphoria?
Yeah, so I'll touch on it towards the end, but nobody, inverted commas, none of the activists are really interested in the DSD categories, only to the degree in which they can use them as ammunition or illegitimately pull research from that category or arguments from that category to try and justify what they're busy doing in the rapid onset group. And then what they're doing is, this population is totally different. The children are different, the ages are different, the causes are different, the presentations are different. And they are illegitimately taking data from the previous or the older research in those classic transgenderism groups, and then applying it to this group. So they're taking data from 40-year-old men and then saying, well, we already know how this works. We're going to apply this data to 13-year-old girls, not understanding what the underlying psychological issues are, what the underlying driving issues are. And then because the other group, the classic groups, are so small, they are vanishingly small. In my medical training over 6 years, having done psychiatry, I don't think I came across one individual. But now there are 3 or 4 per university high school here in South Africa. So when people want to drive activism, they want to do it in such a way that creates social change and impact. So nobody really cares about the classic transgender individuals at all. They're only useful to the degree in which they can be levered for the activism. And that's why all of the focus and all the attention is in this youth group, in this younger group, in this rapid onset group. And that's also where people get why they care about this issue. Because you didn't care generally about the 40-year-old transgender individual. But when this is happening in your school to your children or your daughters or your boys, that's where it impacts. And that's why the activism is so active in this subgroup.
Okay. That's the other thing I wanted to ask, because I just wanted to clarify. I know in the last two groups, the transient gender dysphoria and the rapid onset group, we are focusing on children there. But I'm just curious, are there examples of some adults that are also a part of these categories and having these categories of gender dysphoria, or is it only children that fit into these categories by definition?
No, so the rapid onset, so the desisters and persisters, that categorization only works once you're young. So if you go through puberty and you come out and you still have the transgender ideation, then you are a persister, and then you fall into the persistence category. But I think maybe the biggest difference between the rapid onset and the other categories is that, and that goes back to the question that was asked, what constitutes this gender dysphoria? In the classic picture, you'll have these children from a very early age consistently saying, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, when they're a girl. You don't see this in the gender onset. You see in the rapid onset group, you see it when they're going into puberty. As they're going into that phase and they start having to deal with what puberty means. Plus, they have a whole category of other issues. So if we go back to these categories, and these individuals often have other issues as well: depression, anxiety, eating disorders, cutting. That with adolescence in this environment creates this rapid onset surge. But they don't have anything prior to that. They weren't sitting with this consistent, insistent statement that they are of other gender. Now, just a warning. I've created 4 little boxes, and just with everything biological, biology doesn't fit into perfect little boxes all the time. So this is my framing that I use to try and help people think around it. But you're going to get individuals that overlay that or don't fit into those categories perfectly. But I think it's a useful way of thinking about it broadly.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I was just curious about maybe someone persists until after 18, and then it's transient because then they desist, at the age of 20 or something like that. But you're saying that that's where they would, just by definition, once they hit 18, they are in the category of the persisters.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there are a lot of stories of, again, talking about the classic group, sort of before 2000. There are reports and accounts of those individuals desisting or no longer presenting as trans, still having gender dysphoria, but saying this is not the answer to my underlying problem. And then trying to understand why this came about and what's driving it. And it's interesting when you start to look at it, it's multifactorial. It's a lovely medical word we like to throw around. But it's often not just one thing that's underpinning this. It's a range of drivers that are playing a role in it. And then I think there's a psychological issue or a bent that pushes them in that direction. Just as some people get pushed towards depression, so some of them are pushed to present with this gender dysphoric symptom. But yeah, so what I've reflected on in my own experience here is that there's been this dramatic pushback, maybe not so much in the US, but definitely in the rest of the world. When I started doing these talks back in 2017, there was a it felt that we were like one or two voices against a mass of just the surge that was coming through. But over the last 3-4 years, there's been a really strong scientific pushback against this narrative that gender affirming care is the only way to deal with these people struggling with gender dysphoria. And what's very interesting is that where there are health systems in place that don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, where the medical community is regulated or is overseen by a national health system, those national health systems have come out and reviewed the evidence and have said there are problems with the gender affirming care and it's not as settled as everybody pretends it to be. I think one of the worst, sort of most dishonest statements that I've heard about it actually comes from an American transgender individual, I think it's Rachel Levine, who said that there's no discussion about the value of transgender care. And, here are 6 countries' national health systems that say there is a problem with transgender care. So to pretend like there is no debate about it is just plain dishonesty. So we've seen in Finland and in Sweden and in the England and France, Australia and New Zealand, a wide range of statements warning against or highlighting the lack of evidence that underpins the medicine that's being done in this gender affirming care framework. And as I mentioned, this is what pulled me into the debate and the discussion, because when I looked at the evidence base of this stuff, and I've been involved in some clinical trials where we've evaluated the impact of one drug on people that have had surgery, and we've looked at like 40,000 people to try and follow it up. And even then, we've come out saying, well, we think the drug works, but you need to be careful about this, and we're not sure about that. And there's a whole range of caveats. And the FDA goes through intense grilling of the studies and everything to come up, and they'll say, okay, maybe you can use it for this. The evidence that underpins transgender medicine is not even a fraction of the rigor or the depth and the follow-up of any of the clinical trials that we're doing at the moment. And that it had got so far accepted as though this were just the norm is really mind-boggling. And so what's happened across large parts of Europe and in the Commonwealth countries is that there's been a big pushback against this uncritical acceptance of gender-affirming care. And one of the biggest reviews on this is a review that was done in the National Health Service in the UK. Now, South Africa is quite strongly linked to the UK, us having been part of the Commonwealth, or are part of the Commonwealth. But also our medical training draws very heavily from the British, and we've got very close associations with them. So a pediatrician called Dr. Cass, quite a neutral individual, retired pediatrician, did a 5-year review looking at the evidence base for gender affirming care. And this Cass review, they put out a few statements about a year or 2 ago warning about the evidence base. And this recently came out and has had a massive impact in our community, in the medical community. Contentious, as always, but it's exceptionally well done review from a technical aspect. And they write here, while a considerable amount of research has been published in this field, and that's true, there's a lot of research. The systematic evidence reviews demonstrated the poor quality of the published studies, meaning there is not a reliable evidence base upon which to make clinical decisions or for children and their families to make informed choices. And this is what anybody who's done a non-emotional, technical, scientific review of the data that supports gender affirming care will come up with a statement. There are rules and guidelines on how you demonstrate a quality of a study, of how you set it up, how you follow up. And it doesn't matter how many studies you do, if they're not of a high enough quality to get good data, you don't know what you're doing. And this is the scenario that we've been seeing. They write the rationale for early puberty suppression remains unclear, with weak evidence regarding the impact on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health. The effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown. Clinicians are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity. And this is this issue about persistence or not. So in South Africa, we created a medical group called First Do No Harm, and we've published a range of articles and discussion pieces and engaged on our media around this issue, pushing back against the gender-affirming care narrative. We found that the majority of doctors are uncomfortable with the narrative, that are too afraid to speak out about it. And what I've found is, in my own experience, is that as the data has come out and we've become progressively more aware and it's become more and more public, it's become easier to talk about this. What's also happened is that one of the big organizations that has been driving this whole transgender narrative and pushing it through the WHO is called WPATH. So this is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So when you read the title, it sounds like this is a health organization that consists of like all the world's top gender experts, and it's probably like each country sends their best to this thing. But at its heart, WPATH is an activist organization. It is self-affiliated. It does not represent medical organizations or groups from different countries. It is very aggressively pro-trans. Its ideology runs straight through that. They have put out a series of what they call standards of care. And when you look at their standards of care and you compare them against what quality standards of care or quality guidelines should be, these guidelines don't meet those standards. Recently, there was a rash of internal leaks from some of the communications that showed that the people on the WPATH were raising concerns about the ability of children to understand the implications of what they were doing, but they yet were persisted through with transitioning them. A case of a child seemed to be having a psychotic breakdown, so unable to understand, the very essence of reality, but yet they continue to push them through. And just after that, as a result of one of the lawsuits that's currently being held in one of your states, through the process of discovery, they found that WPATH had commissioned a whole lot of research to be done by Johns Hopkins. But when they started to see the results of these systematic reviews, they suppressed the publication of those findings because it didn't fit into the narrative. So this has put a serious ding into the credibility of this organization, I think, thankfully. So we wrote, it is incumbent upon South African clinicians to note the warning of the French National Academy when they say great medical caution must be taken in children and adolescents, given the vulnerability, particularly psychological, of this population and the many undesirable effects and serious complications that can be caused by some of these therapies available, particularly when we don't understand why it's happening, and particularly with this new population of gender dysphoric children. So here we come. When we push it all to the end, you've got Caster Semenya and the DSD group. You've got Caitlyn Jenner and the persistent gender dysphorics. You've got these children that desist. And you have this new category that has exploded onto the scene of the rapid onset gender dysphoria. If there's one takeaway that I want people to come away from this, is to realize that these things are not the same. It is illegitimate to take research from the DSD categories and apply it to the classic transgender categories of persistent or transient gender dysphoria. But the worst thing that I think people are doing, and they're doing it on purpose, is to take data from these other three categories and then try and apply it to children that are going through puberty, and particularly these girls with the rapid onset. These populations are not the same. They don't behave the same. They haven't come in the same way. They're just different. Everybody knows that they're different, except if you're closing your eyes purposefully to it. And so when I have discussions and debates around these issues, I go to great lengths to try and separate out these issues and to not conflate them, and to be very careful about how you apply the research, if at all you can, to particularly this group of rapid onset dysphorics. So what we've seen in the last probably year and a half in the UK is a dramatic reduction in the number of people presenting to the clinics. The narrative, the craze is starting to drop off. We've seen that similarly in the Scandinavian countries. We're hoping that in South Africa we can avoid some of this incredible spike. What's been sort of a bit sad is to watch what's happening in the US, where there isn't a central national overseeing regulatory body. It's a little bit like in South Africa. And so individual doctors have a high degree of liberty, freedom to do what they want by themselves, and to ignore what the level of evidence actually says. And so the debates that we're seeing in Europe and South Africa is not the same as what we're seeing in the US. I think that these issues have been so tightly entwined with your politics, they've become very, very difficult to separate out. And yeah, that's my talk. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. And perfect timing, by the way. So Reitze was telling me before the show that he wanted to go around an hour and a half. So we are at that mark with the ending. We do have 2 audience questions, if you don't mind just covering that.
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Awesome. So, all right. So this one is kind of, you were kind of talking about this. It's about the politicization of this issue. And specifically they asked, what do you think about the allocation of public resources for addressing these four groups and their issues?
So when I think about these issues, from a theological perspective, medical perspective, I ask myself a question: if this were any other condition, disease, thing, how would we respond to it? And it's clear that, and it's more the classic transgender, that there are children that are struggling with identity issues, with these senses of dysphoria, and that need support and help on that. I think that, and this is consistent with what the evidence shows, they need active management that does not include, that is not centered around affirmation. So they need to be in a psychiatric or psychological support system where they engage with psychologists, where they can get a full assessment, where we can understand what's driving it. And I think allocating cost to that as a support aspect, or even as a treatment aspect, is something that the National Health Service should invest into. And we're seeing that in the UK, we're seeing that in Finland and Sweden. But to allocate funding for the surgical side of it, or for cross-sex hormones, or for puberty blockers, there's no way that you would allow this to happen if it were any other medical condition with this degree of research. And in fact, I would argue that if the state started to support that, you're opening yourself to some serious medical legal liability. And we've started to see some of those cases come through. So in Sweden, at the Karolinska Institute, which is one of the main areas where they do this type of research, and then also in the UK, you can only undertake this type of gender-affirming treatment in the context of a clinical trial, where there's ethics overview, where there's long-term follow-up, where these protocols are carefully set out. And the very fact that they are saying that we need clinical trials for this is demonstration that this is not a standard of care. And I don't see how you can roll out a treatment program within the state system where you're paying for this when we don't know what it does, what the impact of this is.
All right, awesome. And last but not least, so this again is from Marvin Wallace, and he's asking, so if it's permissible to do surgeries and take measures on children and stuff like that, I think he's asking with respect to perhaps like the DSD group, if we discover that there is a disorder here, he asks, would womb transplants ever be ethical in your view?
So they would say to you had a biological male who started to take hormones, and then you decided to implant the uterus into the male, and then somehow allow the male to carry a child to term. Yeah, I would say no. I think there's a range of medical issues with that. I think there's a range of ethical issues of that. No, but we're not at the point where I think we can do that technically. Maybe in sort of 10 to 15 years, that might be something that we would have to face. But I would definitely have ethical issues with it, particularly around the right of that child that's been carried in utero, and then somebody donating the uterus. And then the very issue again, which I think is at the core of this discussion, is what does it mean to be male or female? So yeah, I think there would be a lot of issues there.
All right, perfect. Well, that does it for all of the questions from the audience and everything. So yeah, just want to, out of respect for your time, I'll wrap up now. But I want to say thank you so much for coming on. I think the presentation went great. I love the 4 categories that you give, kind of thing. It does help make sense of all the phenomena that's going out, all the different types. So I hope you enjoyed your time on your end.
Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate being able to join you guys.
No problem. All right, cool. Well, that's it for today. Well, actually, no, it's not. So I will be back on in 3 hours at 7 o'clock with Phil Bear. And he wants to do a review of my discussion with the atheist, Dr. Richard Schoenig, where we were discussing his book, Where Christianity Errs. So tune into that in about 3 hours' time. No rest for the wicked, apparently. So, all right, guys, well, have a great day then, and take care.
Thanks.